Have you ever picked up a Catholic or Orthodox Bible and noticed it's noticeably thicker than a Protestant one? That's not just for show, it's because these Bibles include 7 extra Old Testament books, plus some bonus material in Esther and Daniel that you won't find in most Protestant editions. Protestants call these the Apocrypha, Catholics prefer Deuterocanonical, a fancy way of saying second canon, and though these texts were part of Christian Bibles for over 1,000 years today, most English Bibles leave them out. So, what are these mysterious books and why were they removed? Let's break it down. First, the books themselves. There's Tobit, a story about a righteous Israelite family living in exile in Nineveh. They get tangled up with a demon named Asmodeus, and the angel Raphael swoops in to help. Then there's Judith, featuring a courageous widow who tricks and beheads an Assyrian general. Critics love to point out some hilariously bad history here, like calling Nebuchadnezzar the king of Nineveh. That was definitely not a thing. The Wisdom of Solomon is next. It probably wasn't written by Solomon, but instead blends Jewish theology with Greek philosophy, and was likely composed in the 1st century BC. Sirach, sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, was written by a sage named Joshua ben Sirach, and is basically a collection of proverbs and practical wisdom. Baruch is named for Jeremiah's scribe and includes prayers, confessions, and calls to return to God's law. First and Second Maccabees tell the dramatic story of the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes. And then there are those additions to Esther and Daniel. The extended Esther inserts prayers and explains why God's name is missing from the book. Daniel's extras? They include the prayer of Azariah, the story of Susanna's courtroom drama, and some wild tales like Bel and the Dragon. Altogether, Catholic Bibles add up to 7 extra books: Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and First and Second Maccabees, plus those expansions in Esther and Daniel. So why did Protestants drop these works? The answer traces back to their origins and theology. By the late 1st century, the Jewish community was narrowing its biblical canon. They left out writings that were in Greek or didn't have a known Hebrew version, often because they were written later or had historical oddities. Jewish scholars and historians like Josephus stuck to just 22 Hebrew books as divinely inspired, and the rest, well, they were labeled useful but not scripture. Some early Christian thinkers like Jerome agreed. He pointed out that books like Wisdom, Sirach, Judith, and Tobit weren't in the Jewish canon, even though he still translated a few. But here's the twist. The earliest Christians mostly used the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which already included these extra books. For a long time, there wasn't a set Christian canon, so the default was basically include everything. The Catholic Church eventually formalized their status in the 4th century, at the councils of Hippo and Carthage, and made it official again at the Council of Trent in 1546. Then came the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin wanted to go back to the pure Hebrew Bible. They championed the idea of sola scriptura, scripture alone, and argued that only the books found in the Hebrew canon should count. Early Protestant Bibles still printed these extra books in a separate Apocrypha section, but over time they were dropped altogether. Part of the reason was theological. For example, 2 Maccabees supports prayers for the dead, a practice Luther rejected. The Book of Wisdom talks about the pre-existence of souls, which didn't fit with Protestant doctrine. Protestant scholars also noticed that the New Testament never quotes these books as scripture. You'll find Jesus and the apostles quoting nearly every other Old Testament book, but never with it is written from Tobit or Wisdom. Plus, these books were written during the so-called silent period between the last Old Testament prophet and John the Baptist, when both Jews and Christians said no new inspired prophets were speaking. And let's not forget the historical angle. These books popped up during the Hellenistic era, tackling issues like martyrdom, living in exile, and resisting empire. When the Reformation heated up debates about purgatory, relics, and the role of tradition, books like 2 Maccabees, which talks about prayers for dead soldiers, became battlegrounds. Dropping them let reformers trim away doctrines they believed weren't in the oldest scriptures. So to wrap it up, the missing 7 books, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and First and Second Maccabees, plus extras in Esther and Daniel, were part of early Christian Bibles and are still in Catholic and Orthodox canons. Protestants left them out because they weren't in the Hebrew Bible, weren't quoted in the New Testament, and conflicted with emerging Protestant beliefs. Understanding this history shows how communities shape what counts as sacred, and just how fascinating the Bible's formation story really is. If you enjoyed this dive into biblical history, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe for more explorations of ancient mysteries and theology.